Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 107, Vasily, Vytautas, and Edigu. Unlike Toktamish, Edigu had the same problem as Mamai. He was not of the golden lineage, and he had to work through puppet khans. He had some trouble finding candidates that were amenable to his control, so there was a bit of chopping and changing. As a result, while he was distracted by internal disputes and his conflict with Lithuania and Toktamish, Vasily quietly stopped sending Moscow's tribute to the horde. There was no grandstanding or declarations, no claims to independence. If the question had ever been raised, Vasily would probably have simply said he was not sure who he was supposed to be paying, so he stopped paying tribute. The simplified narrative that Moscow was breaking free of horde control after Kulikovo doesn't really hold up here. The victory at the Vorskla River had restored the horde's authority across the western steppe, and it's a big reach to claim that Vasily might have thought he had a better chance of winning where Vytautas, by far the senior partner in their close relationship, had failed. No, it's much more persuasive to see Vasily as thinking that if he kept quiet, relying on a continuing instability in the horde and Edigu having bigger fish to fry, then he would be left alone. And for about a decade, it worked. Edigu was indeed busy with reuniting the horde under his control. But this changed in 1408. His rival, Toktamish, was dead. His backer and potential source of trouble, Timur, was dead. His authority over the horde was generally acknowledged. Now, Edigu finally turned his attention to restoring Tatar authority over the northeastern Kняжество. We have three almost contemporary texts dealing with the resulting events, which are interesting because they are so different. First, there is a rather bare-bones account in the Troitsky Chronicle, which is accepted to be based on an eyewitness account of the events. Here, the Khan Bulat gives Edigu permission to attack Moscow. He brings a large army with 4 Chinggisid princes, Buchak, Tegriberdi, Altimir, and another Bulat, as well as a number of begs. Vasily abandons Moscow and is chased by Tegriberdi and part of the army. The Tatars seize Pereyaslav and Kolomenskoye, but the walls of Moscow hold strong, and all the Tatars can do is burn the suburbs. Meanwhile, back in the steppe, there's an attempted coup against Bulat while Edigu is away. The Khan sends messengers for help. Edigu accepts a payment of 3,000 rubles to end the siege, but takes thousands of captives to be sold into slavery. His armies plunder the whole of the Rus lands and return to the steppe. The second text is of unknown origins and is more concerned with why the raid happened. The chronicle we've just heard takes the traditional problem that the reason was that it was all a punishment for Rus' sins, but this text is different. In this second text, Edigu is described as a senior prince of the horde. He enthrones and deposes Khans as he chooses. By deceit, he incites conflict between Vasily and Vytautas, promises to aid Vasily against Vytautas, but then betrays him and attacks Moscow. The outcome is the same. Cities are taken, the land is plundered, the people enslaved. Christians are warned that this is the natural result of trusting the godless Ishmaelites. The third text is a purported letter from Edigu to Vasily that's been included in the Novgorod Chronicle. Here, naturally, we find Edigu's complaints against Vasily. He is accused of sheltering the sons of Edigu's enemy, Toktamish, of failing to pay tribute for 12 years, and disrespecting envoys from the horde. Vasily is reminded that his lands are in the ulus of the Khan, and is advised to listen to his elders and cooperate with the horde. The 200 rubles he has sent to the Khan is dismissed as woefully inadequate to pay his debt, and if he does not change his ways, he will suffer the Khan's wrath. The first text, the one in the Chronicles, is very much in line with what we've previously seen and discussed in such texts. It shows in-depth knowledge of the Tatars and scrupulously describes Edigu as acting with the permission of the Khan, an admission that his actions are legitimate. The actions of the Tatars are blamed on the Rus' own actions, and Edigu is not accused of doing anything wrong. At the same time, the relations between Moscow and the Tatars are passed over in silence, with no admission that the Tatars are their overlords. This text is often taken as solid evidence of the resurgence of the horde's power, and that it had restored its authority over the knyazes at this time. The second text is quite different. The author appears to be part of some kind of pro-Lithuanian party and attacks both Edigu and Vasily. This Edigu is deceitful, and the writer is undermining his legitimacy, as was the case with Mamai, by referring to him as a senior prince who picked and chose who would be Khan. There's no evidence that Vasily ever did accept Edigu's patronage against Vytautas, although he did accept Vytautas' patronage. In this text, Moscow and the Tatars are independent states that can choose to ally with each other or not, similar to Moscow's relationship with the Lithuanians. The main offence of the Muscovites for this author is that they supposedly allied themselves with treacherous Tatars instead of with the Lithuanians. It's very unusual for a text from this time to deal with Moscow's status with respect to the horde, and it's more unusual for combining this with an attack on Vasily and a pro-Lithuanian inclination. For the third text, we should note first that it's not a genuine letter from Edigu. It does not follow the horde's diplomatic conventions, and if it was real, it would have been in the name of the relevant puppet Khan, not Edigu. What it actually is a piece of propaganda by a pro-Tatar Muscovite writer. The accusations it makes are verifiable or plausible, Vasily did indeed provide a refuge to Togtamish's son, Zeleny Sultan. The no tribute for 12 years may not be exactly true, but it was true that Moscow had not paid tribute for several years. This letter has Edigu talking up the good old days, when everyone respected each other, relations were mutually beneficial, and Moscow and the Horde lived in friendly harmony. This is the main message of the letter. When Moscow was a loyal part of the Ulus, it enjoyed peace, security, and prosperity. The author wants Vasily to return to that kind of relationship. These texts give us a tantalizing insight into the debates in Moscow at this time, although we don't really have enough evidence to judge how popular the pro-Lithuanian or pro-Tatar positions were, or how openly these policies were discussed. What we can say, though, is that the letter was included in the chronicles without being edited, which suggests that the officials compiling the records did not think that there was anything wrong or unusual with advocating for collaboration with the Tatars, a position that sits at odds with the idea of Muscovites suffering under the hated Tatar oppression. The three texts are hardly compatible in their attitudes, but all of them employ the standard device of complete silence about any hostility between the Rus and the Tatars. Historian Charles Halperin sees them as rounding off the Kulikova era, a return to how things had been before. The Kulikova texts that we looked at previously were unambiguous about Mamai being the bad guy. These texts return to the old silence. Edigu is a Tatar lord, but not a villain. The Tatars enforce their overlordship. There's no mention of conquest, why they're overlords, or of wanting emancipation. While Vasily had been dodging tribute payments to the Horde, he'd also been having some difficulties with his father-in-law. First, Smolensk had developed regrets about Lithuanian rule and tried to return to Moscow. Vasily refused to get involved, but the conflict still dragged on for 3 years. Meanwhile, thwarted in his southern ambitions, Vytautas returned to Lithuania's old ambitions of bringing Novgorod under its sway. In 1406, Lithuania attacked Pskov, and Vasily decided that he would help the city. This set off a small and not particularly intense war that lasted until Edigu's attack on Moscow. After that, Vasily was busy rebuilding, and Vytautas was busy with Lithuanian affairs. But let's step back a few years and catch up properly. As you'll recall, Jadwiga had been barely a teenager when she married Jogaila. Contrary to popular belief, people of the time were well aware of the dangers of early pregnancy, and it was not normal practice to consummate these dynastic marriages between children until they were adults. But waiting for them to be adults did not mean that people wanted to wait any longer than was absolutely necessary, and by the time Jadwiga reached her 20s, people were already becoming concerned by her failure to perform her primary function, to give birth to an heir. The absence of an heir was another reason for Jogaila to ensure that he maintained good relations with his cousin. And there's no fallout that we know of from those reports of Vytautas being acclaimed as king after his deal with the Order. As time went on, the absence of a child became increasingly problematic. Jogaila may have been unsure what his position was without an heir, given the power of the Polish nobility and their ability to decide who held the crown. Finally, in 1399, it was announced that Jadwiga was pregnant. Vytautas sent a silver cradle as a gift. The royal couple ordered horoscopes, which predicted that a son would be born. But on 22nd of June 1399, a girl was born and named Elizabeth Bonifacia, in honour of Jadwiga's mother and the Pope, who had agreed to be godfather. The child was baptized by the Bishop of Krakow, but never thrived and died at just 3 weeks old. 4 days later, Jadwiga, just 25 years old, followed her into the grave. She was the last hereditary ruler of Poland. Jogaila and his descendants would be elective monarchs. A month later, Vytautas was defeated at the Vorskla. It seemed like all of a sudden the union between Poland and Lithuania was up for debate once again. Jogaila had declared his intention to leave Poland as soon as the funeral was over, declaring that he could not remain in another's kingdom after she who had inherited had died. Before he could cross the border, his Polish councillors caught up with him at Lviv and swore new oaths of loyalty, assuring him that he was secure. However, this was far from being enough to settle the issue. Without Jadwiga, and with Vytautas' shortcomings exposed, the gaps between what everybody wanted from the Kriva Agreement and Lithuanian attempts to maintain their autonomy had opened up once again. Jogaila was concerned about the question of hereditary rights, which also raised the issue of a new wife. According to legend, on her deathbed, Jadwiga had asked him to marry her cousin, a granddaughter of Kazimierz III, Anna of Ksielje. This story is probably just some legitimizing cover for the lords of Krakow, insisting that he marry a Polish wife with a royal claim. According to Długosz, Jogaila initially resisted because he did not find Anna attractive, but in the end he agreed. At the same time, Jogaila and Vytautas were working out what their relationship should be. The document that Jogaila wrote has been lost, but we have Vytautas' acceptance, signed and sealed in Vilnius on 18th of January 1401, and a document from March in which it is accepted by the dukes and boyars of Lithuania and ratified by a gathering of 52 Polish nobles at Radom. Some scholars have argued that this was the most important treaty between the two nations, forming a true union with formal provisions on governance, compared to Kreva's simple prenuptial arrangement, and including Poland's formal recognition of Lithuania's separate statehood. Others disagree, seeing it as more of a continuation and expansion of the previous agreement at Ostrava, focused on internal arrangements for the government of Lithuania. Jogaila delegated his rights in Lithuania to Vytautas, but without any right of succession. He retained the title of Supremus Dux Lithuania ac Heres Russiae, and Vytautas gave his oath that upon his death the Grand Duchy would return to Jogaila and his heirs forever. This was therefore a dynastic arrangement about who exercised the rights of lordship rather than an agreement about sovereignty. Some Lithuanian scholars claim that it established Vytautas as the sovereign Grand Duke, and the rest of his reign was spent establishing Lithuania as a separate monarchy, with Jogaila's role entirely nominal. But this is not an accepted consensus. The language of the agreement made it clear that it was not about that. Jogaila personally gave Vytautas dominion over Lithuania without any mention of Poland. Vytautas was not made equal to Jogaila, and Jogaila did not surrender any rights to rule in Lithuania. At the same time, the agreement was also designed to be acceptable to the Polish nobility, who still wanted to see Lithuania incorporated into Poland. As well as to Jogaila, Vytautas renewed his vows to the crown, kingdom, and people of Poland, swearing to assist them when required. The text provided that upon Vytautas' death, his land would return to Jogaila and the crown and kingdom of Poland. Historian Robert Frost sees the agreement as showing that the Polish nobility was prepared to accept practical arrangements for the government of Lithuania that did not directly involve Poland, as long as Poland still had authority, as the oaths of loyalty suggested. So rather than discussing whether Lithuania was incorporated into Poland or not, it would be more useful to consider again what the Poles meant by that tricky word, applicare. Frost sees this as coming down to that distinction between the crown and community of Poland that had already developed. Poland was not a centralized unitary state. Its regions and cities had much of the power, and citizen assemblies met to make or ratify important decisions. While the king governed, this community set the limits on his powers. From a Polish viewpoint, applicare could mean Lithuania joining this community rather than a straight annexation. The Polish nobility were therefore quite willing to accept Vytautas governing Lithuania as Jogaila wished, without making any moves to bring Lithuania under Polish control. For them, a subordinate exercising authority did not threaten the monarch, the superiority of the community, or mean that there was no union. The treaty also provided for the death of Jogaila, as well as of Vytautas. If the king died without an heir, it was agreed that the Poles would not elect a new monarch without first consulting Vytautas and the Lithuanian boyars. These provisions together can be interpreted as meaning that the relationship had become more than just a personal union in Jogaila. There was an association that was intended to survive a succession that did not go to one of his descendants. The Poles thereby also recognized the Lithuanians' right to participate in the community of the nation, and in its most important right of determining the succession. As we shall see in the future, it is the question of succession that remains the driving force in the relationship between Lithuania and Poland. At the time of the treaty, Jogaila was already 50. He had no heir, and his wife was dead. Even if he quickly remarried, and got to work on the problem, it would be years before he could have even a teenaged heir. So, by giving Vytautas a voice in any potential succession, the Poles were putting him in a very strong position, perhaps as a contender himself, or if not, as the guardian or regent for a child of Jogaila. If the Poles viewed Lithuania as the inferior partner, they would allow that not to apply to Vytautas himself. The Treaty of Vilnius-Radom finally brought the instability of the last more than 2 decades to a close. All the parties were now happy. Vytautas and Jogaila were both secure in their positions, and they had found a way to work together. Vytautas had learned a lesson about his limits at the Vorskla and began assiduously cultivating his links with Poland. Vilnius was full of Polish secretaries and officials with skills that had previously been scarce in Lithuania. He built up a clientele in Poland to support him, eventually maneuvering his protégés into positions of power, including ministries and bishoprics. Poland and Lithuania would now truly begin combining their forces into a new power that would dominate Eastern Europe. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.